got here. Stop working. Exercise test today, and then all next week. So this is where we're going to do 2 labs in a row, 2 lab weeks, because it's better to learn by repetition. So just doing one and doing it again, going into the different roles, you'll know it better. So we only have 2.5 EKG lectures to go. Friday and Monday are mostly EKG lectures. I'll throw in a little tiny piece at the end of today. And then at the end of that, you have the entire analysis system, and all you need to do is practice. I put up a key, I don't know if any of you noticed, but I posted a second EKG review set that's for rhythms. I know that Sarah noticed because she sent me an email. You got the answer? Okay. And by this Friday, I will put up a third set that's very short on the topic of hypertrophy and ischemia, which I think is Friday's lecture topic. And that gives you a full week, including weekend, to think about these things for Quiz 3. Quiz 3 is going to be entirely electrocardiographic again. It's the last of your full, except for the final, it's the last of your EKG-based quizzes. Am I making sense? Just trying to keep you oriented. So, as I said, today has 3 parts. We're going to talk about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, finish up with it. And one of the frustrations of it is you can't screen for it. And you guys will think, well, I mean, I was raised on Star Trek, you know, and they had those tricorders that, my God, Tim, this woman has mitochondritis, you know, and the tricorder seemed to be the perfect medical instrument. It turns out it's also imaginary. It doesn't exist. There are no perfect medical instruments. And so I'll go back and explain, we'll go through some of the properties of diagnostic testing and reveal what the problem is. Because this problem isn't just with cardiomyopathy, it's with all rare diseases. You'll see. Then we'll finish with a little coda, just 5 slides about AV blocks. Many of you went through the AV block material on your own. I was so impressed when you came to office hour and then basically learned it yourselves. But I will help. I'll show you some tricks at the end. Okay? So these first slides, I'm going to go a little fast in the first 10 slides. So we finished with this idea that wouldn't it be nice to screen athletes, since high-intensity competition is a precipitate, it doesn't cause the genetic mutation of cardiomyopathy, but it does tend to precipitate clinical events, and it does, over years, drive the hypertrophy by having lots of loading. So wouldn't it be nice to know the people who shouldn't be doing that in advance, right? It's very controversial. A lot of it depends on what country you're in and who is setting your criteria. And whenever you see that, it implies there's a problem. We all agree on how to test for HIV, right? But when you see an argument like this, it's like, okay, so we don't know how to do it. So we're going to use Italy in contrast to the United States. Italy has put a tremendous amount of attention on this. And so they screen I think it's every athlete over the age of junior high has to be screened by the government-funded SWAT team of cardiomyopathy that runs around the country and is paid to do nothing but these. So they do a physical exam, they do a 12 lead, they do a low-intensity exercise test, and then any minor abnormality, they advance to an echocardiogram, which has been $1,000 repeatedly. It's required by Italian law, and anyone who has questionable findings is banned from competition. So there's a lot of ways this won't work. I said our country is too liberal, that it won't let you ban people simply for probabilities. There's also the issue of money, because they have socialized medicine and doctors are paid a pittance compared to here. They can afford to do this. If we tried this, it would bankrupt our entire system. So, what's interesting, I'll show you, when they instituted this, they reported, we had a 90% decrease in sudden cardiac deaths. Wow, this works. And it turns out all they did was catch up to the level of medical care that's being delivered in the United States. So I will show you. This is the European model. In the United States, we do recommend cardiovascular screening. I actually participated in a few of these in my medical time. History, physical exam, listening to the chest. A routine 12 lead is not included in the recommendation. And so you're going to say, why wouldn't you do a screening test or exercise testing? Why wouldn't you do this? Independent of cost. And it turns out it's not that cost alone decides it, but spending money and not getting a result is a bad use of resources. And I'm going to show you why you don't get a result in a moment. So let's say you do a routine EKG. I just finished reviewing all of Amy's EKGs for her class. I looked at all your EKGs. Wow, a lot of really trained athletic people. I was very impressed, especially a lot of the women that show a lot of athletic hearts. Well, remember, if you look at the percentage of abnormal, or I would say on average, EKGs in an athletic population, depending on if they're in aerobic sports, it approaches 50%. So if you do 12 lead screenings, you're going to have a lot of EKGs, and unless you're someone who is deeply familiar with athletic adaptation, those things get flagged. Are you with me so far? And so what happens when they're identified as a positive result on the EKG, but not indicative of disease? Well, in order to prove they're not serious, you have to spend money, electrocardiograms and all. I told you in this class, I once had a student who was that far from getting a catheterization just because she and her mom had worked themselves up into a tizzy over a totally athletic finding that was not related to disease. You stress out the athlete. I've seen people, this right bundle branch block thing that, gosh, 25% of Amy's lab section has an incomplete right bundle branch block. I've seen insurance companies rate your insurance. They say, you have a heart abnormality, you must pay more money. And you go to them and say, look, there is no mortality and morbidity associated with the right bundle. It's a heart abnormality. You have to pay an extra $200 a month. Right? And then, of course, there's the exclusion from sporting eligibility in some countries. So it's hard to say this, but medical care is not good. Medical care is very, very bad unless you need medical care. Right? This is one of the conundrums that let's do a tonsillectomy on you for no apparent reason. That's horrible. Let's do a tonsillectomy because of infected tonsil. Right, then. So it's the deciding. All right, so let's look. It turns out that Minnesota and Italy, they're just about the same population. There are two studies that followed for roughly 2.5 million person years, looking at cardiac sudden deaths, using the two different systems, one with EKG screening and one without. Are you ready? I mean, it's great. It's just a pure accident that, this is Italy. They chose one county, Veneto, which is where Milan, I think, and Venice are in Veneto County. So here's the actual difference. So here's the Italian experience, and here's the Minnesotan experience. By the time they got to about the mid-90s, there is no statistical difference from here on. It turns out that the Italians, mostly with their intensive screening that would be unaffordable in the United States, brought their rate of cardiac death down to what was already existent in the United States. So, bully for them, I'm fine with that, but we were already achieving that with our methods of health screening. Am I making sense? And so it turns out, and then, so you start to worry, what about this half a death per 100,000? I think that's one death per 200,000 would be my impression. What about that death? Is that preventable? And Dr. Marin has devoted, if you're going to read anyone about cardiomyopathy, read him. He spent the last 30 years of his life looking at athletic sudden death. And he says, sudden cardiac death in young trained athletes is a tragic but ultimately low event rate phenomenon that is unlikely to be extinguished by pre-participation screening regardless of the strategy used. Okay? It's one of these, slipping beneath the radar kind of phenomenon. So you won't like that. And that leads to the next part of the lecture, which is important. And in some ways, I don't care if you forget, well, not until the final, but after the final, you can forget everything you ever knew about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. But I sure hope you remember what I'm about to tell you about principles of medical deduction, which is, this is a very general, everyone in med school gets this. And I'm surprised at how many of my practicing colleagues have completely forgotten it, and they treat tests as though they're tricorders, as though they're 100% accurate, and false positives don't exist. And that's just not true. So, the World Health Organization has thought about this. If you're going to screen for a disease, like normal medicine, basic medicine is, you wait till the patient is sick and then you treat them. The disease is present. Screening is different. You're looking in advance of symptomatic disease. And so if you spend more money up front, you better get a return on it. They point out they have 10 criteria. Like, don't screen unless you can do these things. And the two that are most germane for our topic right now is, it must be an important health problem. So cardiomyopathy disqualifies in terms of frequency. It certainly qualifies if it runs in your family. And indeed, that's one place where all forms of screening are used, is if you have cardiomyopathy in your family, boy howdy, are you going to get an echo and a genetic screen, right? But the second issue for us is there must be a suitable screening test that has acceptable levels of sensitivity and specificity. And these are technical terms of the ability of the test to detect people with the disease, and the ability of a negative test to exclude, to identify people who lack the disease. And this is where the real problem comes in. Sensitivity and specificity. Their autopsy is 100% accurate. Most patients refuse autopsy when they're still alive as a diagnostic test. Throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That makes sense. So we're going to learn what sensitivity and specificity are. And all of this gets back to, has anyone ever heard of Bayes' theorem? And did they mention it? There's one Greek guy who teaches mathematics at the undergraduate level on campus, and he actually spends a bunch of time teaching them about Bayes' theorem. And I walked up and said, that's wonderful. You should do that. And of course, they'll forget why. But you guys may remember. So Bayes' theorem, this has been rephrased. What Bayes' theorem really says is the outcome, the likelihood that the disease, let's see, post-test likelihood is dependent on pre-test likelihood. So it's a very general mathematical statement about probabilities, that after a measurement, the post-test likelihood of identification is proportional to how likely it already was that this was present. And so the way we translate that into our language of doctors is predictive accuracy. And I'll show you what, that's a third term you're going to have to learn, but predictive accuracy depends directly on how much disease is prevalent in the population before you do the test. And I'll show you what predictive accuracy is. So let's go down, move it backward. We'll go down here and then move upward. Predictive accuracy is what doctors want. They say, I did a test, the test is positive. How likely is it that that's for real? With me? And almost all doctors in medical testing just assume that it's 100% right. And there are some conditions. For anemia, we tend to directly count the number of red cells these days. And so, yeah, I agree that most medical, barring a drunken lab tech that day, a test for anemia is very likely to be correct that you are lacking red blood cells. Okay? But for many tests, especially for the exercise test that you guys are going to be doing in the lab, it is not true that the predictive accuracy is 100%. It's actually much lower. And even worse is the predictive accuracy depends upon the population and how prevalent the disease is. And this is the huge bugaboo in screening testing. So, unlike predictive accuracy, which is what doctors use, most doctors couldn't give you the equation for sensitivity and specificity. These are properties of the test. They're actually dependent on the test and the cut lines you use, and it doesn't matter. The population's incidence of disease is independent of these two features. So then we'll go back through these simple terms that I think you know. A positive test means the test claims disease is present. Now, a positive test could be false or true, right? If a positive test is false, it means the test claims disease is present, but some other more advanced method says it's not there. Does that make sense? A negative test, again, this, in the public mind, you say you had a negative test. They go, oh, it was negative? Negative has a connotation of bad. It's like, no, negative means the test said the disease wasn't there. Remember, a false negative is not a good thing. A false negative would be the disease is there and you failed to detect it. So that's disastrous. Okay? Am I making sense? You'll see why we're doing this. And this is, so in Bayes' theorem, we're saying the pretest likelihood influences the post-test likelihood. I'm giving you a very rough sort of cognitive analogy based on lottery tickets. So if you're issued an 8-digit lottery number, if you do the math, that to have all 8 in a row, it comes out to 1 in 10 million chance you're going to win. Now let's say your lottery ticket has the first 2 digits correct compared to this week's announcement. So you read the first 2 digits, like, woo. You're now up to a 1 in 1,000 chance of winning. And what we're going to do is measure the next digit. So our test is going to be, we just measure the next digit compared to what the announced winning sequence is. Now notice what happens. If yes, so let's say the 3rd digit comes in right, that makes it 10 times more likely that you're holding the winning ticket. But notice it goes from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 10,000. I'm not sure I'm going to buy a jet ski yet. With that kind of result, it's still vanishingly unlikely. Look at this example, equivalent to a high probability of disease. Let's say you've got the first 6 digits in a row correct, and your test is going to be applied, did I get the 7th digit as well, the penultimate digit? Again, notice it takes you from 1 in 100. If your 7th digit is correct with this winning sequence, you now have a chance of winning of 1 in 10. So once again, it increased the likelihood tenfold. But now you're actually getting into the realm where you might want to talk to an accountant. Or, am I making sense? That this becomes actionable. This is just hope. And so this is the problem. That's Bayes' theorem. So a graphical version of Bayes' theorem, and I've graphed it here using an exercise test. This will confuse you at first. This is the likelihood of having disease before testing. You guys all have a likelihood of coronary disease that is well below 5. You're off the graph down here. If you were to have a positive test during our lab this week, look, you would leap up. This is after our positive test is the blue line. You would leap up to here. So it's still 90% likely you don't have the disease, and it's some sort of false positive. Notice, if you go to someone who has 50% likelihood of the disease, there's 2 lines. These lines are after you do the test. So the person starts at 50% likelihood of the disease. If you do a test and that test is negative, say you do an exercise test for coronary disease, they drop way down here to 25%. Right? You'd be crazy to crack that person's chest, but you might want to increase their preventive care, lower their blood pressure, treat their cholesterol. Am I making sense? If on the other hand, they have a positive test, they leap up towards 85% likelihood of having the disease, and now what you might do is do a follow-up test. That might be a person will you be taking to the catheterization lab to look at their coronaries. See how it's a probability sieve. You're putting it through different steps, moving up in probability, trying to spend the least amount of money and do the most good for the patient. Am I making sense so far? So that's Bayes' theorem. Now, predictive accuracy is the probability that a positive test actually has the disease. For instance, I mentioned that if you have an exercise test, let's say the person you're doing the test on, let's say it's a 70% likelihood. They're complaining to you of a symptom in their daily life and they have at least 3 risk factors. So let's go up to 70. I think I've told you several times now that if you're lucky enough to get an electrocardiographically positive test, which is what this refers to, just the EKG, and the patient is kind enough to have their symptom, the way that Sam, your case study, had their symptom, that combo of internal sensation plus classic changes on the EKG, that will jump you from 70 to 95%. So Sam went directly to the cath lab and had a quick 2.5 test. He's still alive, by the way, and he thinks I'm pretty cool about it. So, predictive accuracy is, I have a positive test, how likely is it it's true? I've just given you one example. If you can have an exercise test that has electrocardiographic and typical symptoms, it's pretty likely, it's 95% likely. So, to show you, predictive accuracy would be the true positives divided by all the people with the disease. So it would be the true positives divided by the true positives plus, sorry, I said that wrong. It's the fraction of true positives among all positives. So you combine false positives, true positives as your denominator, and put the true positives on top as your numerator to get a fraction. And this depends on the frequency of the disease in the population, and that's what I'm going to show you next. You're being very brave. So sensitivity, there's a complex equation you've got to learn. Sensitivity is the ability of the test to actually detect disease when it's present. This is what I was starting to derive on the last slide. So in sensitivity, you take true positives, and the denominator is all people who actually have the disease, right? And so the denominator would be true positives and false negatives. So the denominator here is all people with the disease. The numerator is true, right? And this is pretty fixed. In an exercise test, it's about 70%, 60%, depending on how good you are. And we'll look at what this means in a moment. This shouldn't mean anything to you yet. You have to see the application. Specificity in a test is the ability to exclude disease. The test says, oh, negative test, when the person doesn't have the disease. In some ways, this is more important. If most people don't have the disease, you'd like to not. And so what that is would be true negatives divided by all the people who don't have the disease. All the people who don't have the disease are the false positives plus the true negatives. So that to generate these statistics, you obviously have to do a lot of follow-up. You have to take a big population and do a lot of testing to figure it out. So this is worth remembering, this table. So if we have a 1%, what is the incidence in here? Remember, for cardiomyopathy, the presence of the genotype is 1 in 500. The presence of the phenotype is probably more like 1 in 10,000. So you're talking about a tiny fraction of a percent. Watch what happens when you do a screening test with a low prevalence disease. So if you take, let's first do the sensitivity. The sensitivity is you have 100 diseased people and 60% of them had a true positive. That would give you a 60% sensitivity, because you're adding in for the denominator the false negatives of 40, where you missed the disease. Now, that's not the worst problem. The worst problem will be, look at specificity. You have, this is out of apparently 10,000 people. Did I do the math there? Yeah, 10,000. So, if you take the people who don't have the disease, if you have a 90% specificity, that number, which is true negatives, divided by this number, will come out to be 90%. You with me? But look at the number, that number divided by all the people without the disease, which is that and that added together, which is that. It comes out to 90%. With me? But look what happened, 90% of such a big population. Look what that means about false positives. You have almost 1,000 people who have had a false positive, And now you're going to start to hemorrhage healthcare dollars, scare the crap out of them, and actually endanger their health and life by doing invasive follow-up testing. Are you with me so far about what the problem is? Okay. So if you're in this situation, you've applied, this is doing 12 lead EKGs looking for cardiomyopathy. Watch what happens to your predictive accuracy. So the predictive accuracy of the test is to take all the true positives over all the positives. So what is the likelihood that a positive test is correct? It's not even 6%. The likelihood in this population that a positive test is a false positive is 94%. Are you with me? See what a mess you create? Yeah.
And it's not because the symptoms are so similar to the baseline.
Oh, remember, these people, a lot of these people will have no symptoms. But true and false, all of this is based just on the EKG. Independent symptoms act, they're in a different epistemologic realm. They're a different measurement of reality. I don't know how to say it. So symptoms are off the list here. Now you can look at this one where there's a 10% prevalence of the disease, but I want to jump ahead. I made my own example. Oh, by the way, this is pretty much verbatim for an exercise test. This would be what happened if you used an exercise test and went out screening adults over 40. And it turns out to be almost as bad as last slide, slightly better. Now watch this, because this is what I made my own for what in 2019 we are now doing with exercise stress testing. We initially started using it as a screening test on everybody and created a huge mess with the false positives. So nowadays what we do, remember how Sam and Bonzo actually seemed like kind of scary case studies? Turns out those are the people, if the person doesn't have at least a 50% chance of the disease in that range, 25 to 50, you probably shouldn't do the test. It's not going to have a sufficient predictive accuracy. So if nowadays we try to make sure that people have at least 2 risk factors and maybe a symptom or something confusing, then if you do that, you come out with, let's see, you could go through this, but still the sensitivity here will be 60%, the specificity will be 90%, because that's how I did the math. But notice, because predictive accuracy depends on the prevalence of the disease in the population, you've jumped up to nearly 70% predictive accuracy. So here's a place where, and if the test is negative, this person's likelihood of the disease will drop down below 10%. So this is where you're really getting big yield with your testing. You're greatly changing the likelihood for the patient, and you can guide yourself on that. Does that make sense? So these days, in 2019, we try by our physical exam, our preliminary evaluations, to only expose the patient to testing if they have a high probability of the disease, because that lets the predictive accuracy be better. That make sense? So for you guys, I don't want you to get too lost in the exercise example. Why don't we screen every person in the United States for AIDS? We have a test. We have 2 different tests. We have an ELISA test, and we have the blot, Western blot, as a follow-up. Why don't we do that? It will cost money, but gosh, it would save a life. Let's spend money. What is the prevalence of AIDS in the United States? It's in college students, I happen to know the stat. It's 1 in 400 of college-age people. 1 in 400. So that's 1/4%. Are you with me? So if I screen the entire United States, and I have, let's say, I don't know how many, we have, 400 million people. We'd have about 1 million positives. And of those 1 million positives, how many actually have the disease? Less than 5%. Am I making sense? So when you do a screen, it's not a good idea. There is actually a thing called the Preventive Care Task Force in the United States. It's well over 1,000 men and women, physicians, and researchers who try to decide, is there a disease we can screen for? Because screening for diseases is great. Vaccinating is even better. But it turns out that because of this purely statistical phenomenon, it is hard to screen in advance for diseases. So we have a whole task force of thousands of people trying to figure out. So for the most part, if if the National Preventive Health Task Force didn't recommend a screening test, don't have it done. Those calcium screenings or chest CT scans that your parents may be tempted to get, don't get those. Does that make sense? So, excellent. That means there's enough time to finish the lecture. That's even better. Any questions about that? It's very, I was commenting, Jen and Mesa were going over their immunology stuff, and they are learning levels of antibody genetic differentiation that I didn't get until medical school. And this is part of my pity and compassion for you guys, that remember, medical knowledge doubles roughly every 30 years, which means that there's at least 4 times as much stuff in your classes as was in mine. I didn't get this stuff until I was in grad school. So feel proud of yourselves, and then also have pity and compassion on yourselves, because you're actually learning a lot. Yeah, so any questions about sensitivity, specificity? Play with those numbers. You will need to know it for the final. I won't pick on you about it until then, but the take-home point is sensitivity and specificity are properties of the test. If you can get a test that has 90% on both, wow, now you can really start to screen for some not common diseases. This is like the testing we do for phenylketonuria on newborn babies for stewarding, right? We don't have to have metabolic disease, brain death in young children if we identify the disease in advance and deprive them of proteins that contain a lot of phenylalanine. Did I get it right? Good for me. But that's because we had a great test. Okay, very good. So, new topic. Everyone's brain okay? I know I'm giving you a lot of stuff, but okay, this will be fun. This part's easy. We're going to go back to electrocardiography and leave behind cardiomyopathy. So cardiomyopathy is interesting. It's a great, sometimes, do you guys ever watch the really gory police dramas like Bones, and there's people cutting up bodies and stuff, and there's sort of a fascination with the morbid. So cardiomyopathy is interesting in the sense that it's very morbid. And, it's deadly. It's clearly not normal behavior of a heart to do that. As I said, it's sort of the perfect storm of a disease that you can't strain for it, it's hard to diagnose, you can't treat it. When those people drop down on the floor, they're also really hard to resuscitate because their heart is basically in vapor lock. And they're notoriously hard, even if you have watched them drop and have a defibrillator in your hands, to get the heart to roll. It's almost like you got to dump a bunch of adenosine to paralyze the heart, flood them with fluid to get the heart to open up again, and then try to restart. It's just, the whole thing's horrible. And, as you've just seen, at least partially unpreventable. So, now we're going to move, where we're headed in class is I'm going to show you a little bit more electrocardiography so you have your whole armamentarium of electrocardiographic knowledge. I will do a whole lecture on hypertrophy and ischemia, which are the last 2 parts of electrocardiogram you don't understand. And right now I'm just going to do a little tiny piece on the AV blocks. Now, you already know 2/3 of these. So, there's 4 kinds of AV block. And they are a little confusing at first because you should get the practice whenever you look at your rhythm strip. You've seen me do it. You go PQRST, PQRST, you just track all of the, and when you run into something that does, you can't say the mantra, it means something's wrong. In particular, if you ever see 2 P's per QRS in an electrocardiogram, you're probably in a 2nd or 3rd degree AV block. And we'll do that right now. We'll show you that. So, to go through the 4 different kinds of AV block, you already know the first kind. That's where the 1-to-1 atrioventricular, or P to QRS ratios, is still 1-to-1. It's just there's a delay. It's like the AV node is being a little hyperprotective of the ventricle. And so you know that one already. That's a first degree of U block. Many of you have that as an athletic manifestation. And so you'll find that one when you do your interval measurements at the beginning of my system, right? You do rate, conduction intervals, axis, and you'll find your first degree of U blocks there. These second and third degree of U blocks always have more than one P wave per QRS, and we'll start to look at it. So this is easy. You find that during your conductions. There's two kinds of second degree AV block, type 1 and type 2, and then there's third degree AV block. It turns out that these two are almost best seen by their footprints rather than their P waves, and I'll explain that in a moment. In a third degree AV block, the atria and AV node are completely disconnected from the ventricle. Well, presuming the person's alive, who's running the ventricle then? The ventricular myocytes. And so the rate in a third degree AV block is very slow. It's usually 20 to 30. The person can barely rest functionally. And so you get slow. Also, what will the QRSs look like if they're not using the Purkinje conducting system? Slow. They'll be wide because they're moving through the heart muscle itself. And so what you'll see is a very slow, wide QRS. And there'll be P waves in there, but the P waves have no relationship to it. You'll often see the atrial rate is 70 and completely normal. But because none of it ever gets down to the ventricle has a rate of 35, and it's wide and too slow. So this one, you get a regular, very slow pulse. In the second degree AV blocks, what second degree is, some P waves get through, and some P waves don't. And this creates a footprint where if there's two P waves in here, it creates a pause in the QRS response. And so what's called group beating, where the QRSs cluster into little groups. And whenever you look at the gap, you see more than two P waves. That is a second degree AV block. So second degree AV blocks have this funny group beating phenomenon. Third degree AV blocks are dead regular in their ventricular response. And both of them have more than one P wave per QRS at least once in a while. Are you ready to look at some? This will make more sense after you've seen them. So here's lead V1. Let's use as much of our system as we can. Let's do a rate. Move this one in your mind to that line. 300, 150, 100, 75, and this shifts. So the heart rate's here about 75. Can we do an axis on a single lead? No. Can we do conduction intervals? Yes. And so when you measure, that's up. So you got to do your little mantra, P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T, P. You can already see something bizarre. P to QRS seems to be something like well over, it's almost 2 big boxes. So it's like 0.3 seconds. It's a first degree block. Then you want to be careful to measure your conduction interval for the QRS, and it seems to be reasonable. Yeah, it's about 2.5 little boxes, so no bundle branch block, but a definite delay happening in the AV node. So that's first degree block. Is that okay? Yeah. Now look down, we're going to do the third degree AV block next, because in many ways it's easier. It's the second degrees that will drive you crazy first. So look down here. This looks like a different lead. That's probably lead 2. Let's first do the rate. So see this in your mind, line it up with that big box. You ready? 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50. It's like 50, it's like 43, 45. Right? Notice, is the QRS narrow or wide? It's actually kind of wide. There's a little Q wave here, so it starts there. Probably goes over to here, so you've got at least 2 boxes, and then you've got a half box on either side. Okay? Then let's do our PQRST. Ready? PQRST. PQRST. QRST, PP. QRST, PP. Again, whenever you have PP, you have a second or third degree V block. Okay so far? Then the last step for being sure, so because this is regular in its ventricle, it is very likely to be a third degree. The final step of confirming it's a third degree is notice the P waves. If this is a sinoatrial node doing its normal thing, and it just can't get through, the P waves, suddenly all these funny little intermediate forms that are kind of stuck in the QRS, see that? That's a P wave right there. You see it? So it's like a really bad marriage where the husband is saying, but honey, I want you to, and the wife is completely checked out, and it's like, I'm just not listening to you. I'm doing my own thing. I'm going out to my she shed and you're on your own. Am I making sense? So that's a third degree. So now we'll do the hard ones. I have to take off my jacket. Got 5 minutes. This is easy. I only got 2 slides. This slide, the next slide. So this is another third degree V block, and then we'll do the hard ones. So again, we look at this. Let's get a rate here. Ready? We'll go move that one back. 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50, a little bit, so it's 50. If you measure the width of this QRS, you're going to find that it's too wide. It's at least 3 boxes wide. Now let's do our little mantra. I don't know if that's a P. Let's call that a P. P, QRST, P. Sometimes it's better to start with QRST. QRST, P, P, QRST. There's 2 P. P, P, QRST, P, P, QRST. I got more than 2 P's per QRS. The QRS is slow and wide, and it is evenly spaced. Third degree V block. By the way, you guys are always asking, what do you do about certain things? This one I have an answer for. This person needs a pacemaker, because their ventricular response is stuck down at 40. They come up a flight of stairs, dilate their muscles, they'll pass out. So these people need pacemakers. And do quite well if you get them one. They have specific conduction disease. So their His bundle or their bundle branches are dead. The rest of their heart is fine. So if you're going to replace the pacemaking conduction down in the ventricle, they'll be great. We even have now some pacemakers that will measure these P waves, and then you get a little wire that goes and activates the ventricle as soon as the P wave happens. And those rock because they're connected to, if you're going off the P wave, that's connected to the autonomic nervous system. So that restores almost normal function. Okay, second degree V block, we said, creates group beating. So don't look close at the baseline yet, just look. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Doesn't have to be even. Oh, this is 2. 1, 2, pause. What, you see it from a distance? Hadak has their Sahi have the best views for this. Seeing it from a distance. Now, if you do your PQRS, watch P, QRST, P, QRST, P, P. It's either a second or a third degree. Is it a third degree? Because it's slow and regular? No, your QRSs are varying. Okay. Now, the last step. So anytime you see, let's do this one up here, because these are both second degree blocks of 2 different types. Look at this one. P, QRST, P, QRST, P, QRST, P, P, QRST, P, QRST, P, QRST, P, P. So as soon as you see 2 P's, but with group beating, it's some form of second degree V block. And here's where it gets a little, you got 2 minutes, you can figure this out. The one that is concerning is the 2 type 2. So second degree V block type 2, also called Mobitz 2, after the eponym after the doc who found it. Notice that if you were to measure these QRSs, they're always the same when they conduct. So sorry, I'm saying it wrong. The PR interval, the conduction interval between the atria and the ventricle, when it conducts, is the same. And the problem is, every once in a while, it just completely drops a beat. I think of this like a wire that's been cut and it's got flickering. Either it arcs and actually conducts, or the wire separates and it fails altogether. These people will ultimately need pacemakers. They may not need it this week, but this is a sign of serious conduction disease and they will degenerate. Now, the other one, this is the one that you guys are eligible for. So it's got a lovely little eponym, Winky Bach. Does Winky Bach sound nice? Winky Bach. Winky Bach is really a physiological block. And watch what's happening here. Look at that PR interval. Look at that PR interval. See how it's longer? Boy, now this one is way long, and then it completely fails. And then it shortens up again. So what's happening here is the vagal tone on the AV node is varying. And at certain points goes too high and completely blocks conduction. This is almost a physiological, sometimes a drug will do this. If you use digitalis that specifically blocks the AV node, this is a common result if you give them too much. I've seen this in athletes who just have a really high vagal tone. Exhale for me. They exhale, their heart rate slows down, and they block out one of their inhale. Feel that. So, Winky Bach is a physiologic nuisance, perhaps, at the worst. This is second degree AV block type 1. Second degree AV block type 2 with a fixed PR interval is a sign of serious degenerating conduction system. And so you can be ahead of the curve and get them scheduled for their pacemaker in the future or evaluated in an electrophysiology lab to see how stable.
The middle one's also a
Yeah, they both are. Oh, the middle one. Oh, I didn't do the middle one. Let's figure out which one it is. What a great, good way to finish there, and we have a minute to do that. So we got PQRST. There's a first degree block here for sure. PQRST. Oh, this is getting longer. Look, Sarah. Longer. If there's two P's in the next one, you can't even see the two P's, but you're suspicious because this shortened up again, got longer, got longest, and I think this other P is like there. So this is a great example where this is Winky Bach, even though you can't see the two P's because of the footprints and the lengthening PR interval. Yay. Okay, now you know all about rhythm. The only two topics left for electrocardiography are hypertrophy and ischemia.